This program, while curated to help you improve your health, contains general advice and should not replace the individual advice of your medical practitioner.
Turns out that being on your period doesn't make you weaker. It actually makes you stronger. Oh, whoa, that's so opposite of what I was taught growing up.
We continue to accept false mythology about our biology.
I'm definitely seeing young girls experience early puberty.
The American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists decreed that your period should be considered your fifth vital sign.
In life, it's normal to have ups and downs. But what do we do when we get stuck? I've always been fascinated by the healing journey. Why do some people get better while others fail to make the shift? In Season 2 of The Shift, we explore the intricate world of women's health and help you discover how to balance your hormones and understand yourself better so that you can truly thrive.
The menstrual cycle is a vital sign of female well-being.
My mum just used to say, "Oh, Nan, I'm so sorry. It's part of being a woman."
I would like a call to arms for women to know that their intuition isn't lying to them.
I'm Katherine Maslen, and this is The Shift. Having a regular bleed is such a huge part of our lives as women, but it's very poorly understood. There is so much taboo over this healthy and natural female function. Menstruation has been shrouded in so much secrecy and shame that many of us were never taught about our cycles and how to understand this important part of ourselves. What if you could harness the power of your hormones rather than fear them? Don't worry, I know that for many of you this feels like a fantasy. But I want to open you up to the possibility that we can work with our hormones to make us feel good. My hope is that by listening to this episode, you can begin to understand what is really going on with your cycle and begin to see some ways that you can tune back in and understand your body more. In this episode of The Shift, we're going to explore the hormones involved in your menstrual cycle, how they work and why they're so vital to your health. Whether you're on contraception or not, it is every woman's birthright to understand their own body, and this episode has been put together to help you do just that. And if you're not a menstruating woman, I'd still encourage you to listen through. This information needs to become commonplace, and by being informed, we can pass this wisdom along to those that need it the most. Getting your head around the inner workings of your cycle can be tricky. So I'm going to begin by walking you through the basics of your menstrual cycle and the hormonal changes involved. You'll also hear from our experts who will help to consolidate this information, so don't worry if it seems a bit much or hard to understand right away. Your menstrual cycle exists for one purpose: to help you conceive and carry a healthy baby. But as we move through each of these cycles in our lives, we make hormones which have many, many health benefits to us and are essential to our health as women. Your cycle begins at menarche, which is the term used for your very first bleed. Traditionally, this moment would have been celebrated. Your first bleed indicates that you are becoming a woman. Your menstrual cycle consists of 4 distinct phases: the follicular phase, ovulation, the luteal phase, and menstruation or bleeding. Let me walk you through what happens during each so that you can understand what your body is trying to do. The follicular phase happens when you begin menstruation and essentially means the first part of your cycle before ovulation occurs. As women, we are born with all of our eggs, and ordinarily every month just one of these is released from one of your ovaries. During the follicular phase, some of these immature eggs will begin to ripen and the follicles will form around them. This is why it is called the follicular phase. A hormone called follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, is involved in this ripening, but it isn't until your body begins to increase estrogen levels that ovulation can occur. Remember those follicles that were ripening? Well, only the healthiest will make it, and one lucky egg will be released in the process of ovulation. What happens is that estrogen rises, triggering the release of luteinizing hormone, or LH, which triggers the release of your egg. So we have the follicular phase, where you're ripening your eggs, the ovulation phase, when you're releasing the egg, and then we have the luteal phase, which happens after the egg is released. Once you ovulate, that little follicle that helped the egg turns into a little sac called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum has an important job. It secretes the hormone progesterone. Along with estrogen, progesterone helps to grow and plump up your uterine lining in the luteal phase, ready for implantation by the egg. The luteal phase is usually 14 days long, and if pregnancy has not occurred, the corpus luteum stops producing progesterone. The drop in your progesterone levels causes your uterine lining or endometrium to begin to shed, and voila, you have your period. The menstrual phase of the cycle is where we shed all of the uterine lining to begin anew. What is important to understand about the phases of the menstrual cycle is that they act like a fluid symphony rather than isolated events. During your menstrual cycle, estrogen, progesterone, luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone work together in concert to make these changes occur in a smooth and seamless manner. When things go wrong, as they often do, it's not about a specific hormone, but more about a change and how that relates to the rest of your cycle. When we can understand the natural flow and symphony of our menstrual cycle, we can begin to discover why things go wrong and what we need to do to make a shift. Dr. Lara Brydon is a naturopath and the author of the Period Repair Manual and the Hormone Repair Manual, so she knows a thing or two about hormonal health. I started with asking her what the benefit of having ovulatory cycles are. Ovulatory cycles mean a natural cycle when you ovulate. This is converse with anovulatory cycles, which can happen because of issues like PCOS or from taking contraceptive drugs. We will talk more about the impacts of contraception in the next episode, but for now I want to explore what having normal menstrual cycles means for us as women.
Because ovulatory menstrual cycles, a menstrual cycle in which ovulation is the main event, is how women make hormones. We need to ovulate every month because that's how we make estrogen and progesterone, which we need for general health, not just to make a baby. I mean, the other way to make those hormones, of course, is with a pregnancy. But in our modern world, most of us are not going to have 10 pregnancies through our life. Instead, we're going to have about 400 periods on average, 400 monthly cycles of making hormones. And with those hormones, we're building up metabolic reserve. So each and every ovulatory cycle, each and every dose of estrogen and progesterone builds health. It builds bone density. It builds cardiovascular health. It builds brain health. It's good for mood. I think of it like each and every ovulatory cycle is like a deposit into the bank account of long-term health that we can then draw on for the rest of our lives, even after menopause and we stop having menstrual cycles.
If cycles are so healthy for us, why are they shunned and dismissed as not being necessary for health? Before we continue, I want to point out something that I'm sure you're all familiar with, and that is the fact that the cultural attitudes towards menstruation are not overall positive. In fact, I'm sure that every woman has a memory of feeling shameful about her period or that she'd rather live without it. If we look at a period as a part of health, we need to begin to examine these deep cultural beliefs about what a period means to us, and we really need to change the narrative.
We can go all the way back to sort of biblical references and then sort of how that trickles out to major institutions of social learning. I think that that's a piece of the story. I think the bigger piece of the story that, and there's not much we can do about the past. The past it's in the past, right? What I like to focus on instead, it's the fact that we continue to accept false mythology about our biology. And we also are completely underserved during pubescence about getting a proper education about what's going on. And so we're often blindsided by our period or we're traumatized by it in some way. And that trauma is held in the body, in the psychology. And it creates a situation where you begin to feel at conflict with yourself. And one of the ways that that can manifest is by feeling grossed out, let's say, with your own biology and your own blood. And of course, then how the past has influenced our cultural narrative is that we all feel like it's this taboo subject and that it's normal to retain the belief that it's taboo and gross, neither of which are true, but also how each of us today don't challenge what we're being told enough.
That was Alyssa Vitti, author of In the Flow and founder of Flow Living. Alyssa spends a lot of time advocating for the normalisation of periods, and you'll hear more from her as we go through the series. While I set out to make this series on women's health and hormones, what became very clear as I conducted my interviews was a groundswell for us to help women honour their bodies and the process of menstruation. I spoke with Dr. Peter Wright, a wonderful gynaecologist based in Brisbane, Australia, who specialises in infertility and pelvic pain. We got talking about the dysfunction in the medical system and the trends towards women looking for a more nurturing journey when it came to their gynecological health. We got talking about the traditions of red tents and women's circles. A red tent is where women who are bleeding would gather once a month to connect. In these times, periods were seen as sacred, and a woman's unique hormonal changes were something to be honoured, not shamed.
Women have always known their stuff about themselves, but patriarchy and our culture that has basically raised women to not even mistrust our bodies, but basically to hate our bodies, to be ashamed of our bodies from the very first, from basically puberty onward. You know, you have a little girl, I think, don't you? Mm-hmm. I have a stepdaughter, and you're seeing your kids from these gregarious, beautiful, confident children, and then the puberty hits, and then that's shame, not liking their bodies, everything's wrong with their bodies, women thinking that they have to be this one thing, that there's constantly something to fix. That's a huge part of it as well. We know, I think, deep down that we're beautiful, amazing creatures who have a hormonal cycle that's not 24 hours like men. And we did have that way of connecting with each other and with ourselves in the past with women's circles and slowing down and being with the rhythm of nature in our bodies, which we've lost because we've been forced to toe the line, live in this world that just worships that 24-hour productivity at all costs model. And I think we need to reject that.
The conversation continues in our Shift community group. Join the group by heading to theshiftclinic.com/links. The Shift! This coming of age for women is fraught with so many difficulties, some of which I hope to dispel with the reach of this podcast series. Kate Reardon is a naturopath, intuitive healer, and most importantly of all, a mother of 3 girls. She has dedicated a lot of her life to understanding the feminine and the stages we go through physically and emotionally as women.
I think as women, a lot of our physiological stages in life are celebrated in various different ways. I still don't think they're celebrated enough, but they're acknowledged. So our first bleed, for example, when we start our menstrual cycle, maybe the first time that we have sex when we lose our virginity, definitely pregnancy, you can't kind of hide or avoid that one, birth, postpartum, menopause. I mean, these are all things that we know that happen to us as women. I know that I'm going to go through this trajectory and these particular anatomical, physiological things are going to happen to my body. However, what's really, really missing from that is the mysticism, the ceremony and the ritual. And this is probably even more important in understanding as women so that we can fully be our whole selves.
One thing is for certain, our culture around periods, our femininity, and these natural cycles we go through as women needs to change. We talk more about this as we move through the series, especially when exploring our emotional well-being in episode 12 and the transition of menopause in episode 15. Let's now take a walk through the process of getting our periods and see what is changing with this in modern times. I spoke with Dr. Lara Bryden about what happens when we first get our period and how the body adjusts.
An interesting thing about the menstrual cycle is it takes about 12 years to mature that. So that means the communication between the brain and the ovaries takes 12 years to calibrate, which, for example, if a girl gets her period for the first time at 13, it's not until she's 25 that she is fully in the groove of having a regular ovulation, making a good amount of progesterone with that ovulation, having that phase between ovulation and the period, a strong, 14 days, luteal phase. And if a woman is not given the opportunity to mature her menstrual cycle because of, for example, being put on the pill at a young age, she will, when she comes off contraceptive drugs, have to pick up where she left off and resume that process of calibrating or maturing the menstrual cycle. And that's why it's not uncommon if a woman has been on the pill since she was young and then comes off in her 30s that she'll find that her menstrual cycles don't immediately start up. It can sometimes actually take a year or two to really get going. And even then, when they first get going, she might have lower levels of progesterone than might be expected. And it's really just all about that maturation of the menstrual cycle.
On average, when I was growing up and in my research, girls would go through puberty and get their period around 13. That age seems to have shifted to be nowadays around 11. And I think there's many reasons why that's happening. Generally noticed signs of the breast buds should really be the first thing that you start to see, followed by some pubic hair and some lovely odors coming from your daughter's underarms. And then that progression you generally find then shifts into eventually, usually around a year later, they'll start to have their monthly menstrual cycle or their period. It's not always regular to begin with, and that's okay. And I think it's teaching parents this information too, because we can often freak out when it's not what we remembered it to be. But if you really think about anything else that happened to you when you were 13 or 14, it's quite sketchy. So just knowing, I think that's the very general natural progression. I'm definitely seeing young girls experience early puberty. So I think there's a lot to be said about this activation of the adrenals, and that makes sense. And it's often in children that I'm observing, if it's outside of something more serious. I mean, a tumour can be something that will impact puberty and make that happen earlier. But outside of that, and in all the cases I've seen, there hasn't necessarily been any abnormal growth that might be affecting the pituitary for that to happen. It seems to me like they have had some type of heightened experience of stress in their early childhood that I can only correlate that with that early activation of the adrenals to then promote or turn on those hormones for that development of the breast buds. And the interesting thing I find with precocious puberty and early onset puberty is they don't tend to show signs of breast buds first. They tend to show signs of pubic hair and body odor first. So again, your body's always giving you pieces of information. And as a parent, I feel like that's really important to understand for your children so that you can navigate that in the right way. And I just find it very interesting. Again, we come back to this topic of stress, and I don't think we think about the long-term implications of that. We kind of think about the now, but it doesn't just stop with pregnancy or puberty. It's forever. So managing that becomes so important for not just yourself, but future generations as well.
That was Nat Kringoudis, Doctor of Chinese Medicine and author of the book Beautiful You, which is a guide for our young women to navigate menarche, puberty, and everything in between. When talking about early puberty, I'm always concerned about the risk of environmental chemicals. We're going to talk about these in depth in episode 8, but I wanted to ask Dr. Ailey Cohen, rheumatologist and environmental health expert, if she'd found any evidence of endocrine disrupting chemicals impacting on early menarche.
I think that's moving to becoming more of the trend, believe it or not, more than the exception. And I would go on to say that African American young girls are actually having the greatest change in the start of menarche. And that's believed to be related to some of the products that are marketed and used by young African American girls. And that would include hair relaxers, hair dyes, and many of the chemicals that are used to relax hair amongst African American girls is made with placental chemicals used from actually a placenta. And so there's estrogenic compounds in that material. So this is something that's really worrisome. And since girls of all ages are using a lot more products than maybe you and I did when we were growing up, because there's just many more billions of a company's worth of marketing going on, we really want to think about that, because the younger you are exposed to estrogens, in other words, the earlier you start menarche, the longer you're exposed throughout your lifetime, generally speaking, until menopause, that contributes to a higher risk of developing breast cancer.
The synopsis here is that young girls are getting their periods earlier and earlier. This is an issue, as research shows that the earlier we get our period, the higher risk of depression and antisocial behaviours such as drug and alcohol use. There is some evidence that it may lead to increased risk of diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular disease. We're not sure exactly why these issues are more common in girls who begin to menstruate earlier at this stage, but it's still something to keep in mind. Let's now turn our attention to what a healthy cycle means for our health and what you need to look out for when assessing if your cycle is out of whack.
We know from the research that women who have natural menstrual cycles through their life are likely to live longer. That's just coming out now. There was a research at the end of 2020, the British Medical Journal, looking at that. And there could be different reasons for it, but I think one way to interpret that information is that the hormones themselves, estrogen and progesterone, that we make with our menstrual cycles are beneficial for long-term health. Estrogen, for example, improves insulin sensitivity, so helps to prevent insulin resistance. Both hormones are very good for cardiovascular health. So that's one of my key messages to women, is that this is something we need to do to be healthy in the long term and also to be healthy in the short term, because our hormones are beneficial for short-term health effects like mood, even though I know hormones have the reputation of being bad for mood, but that's not the case. Both estrogen and progesterone have a mood-enhancing effect if we're able to respond to them properly.
That was Dr. Lara Bryden again. I asked Alyssa Vitti what a healthy menstrual cycle looks like and if we could use it as an indicator of health.
In a healthy menstrual cycle, you want to look for color of the bleed, texture, regularity of the cycle, length of the flow. These are powerful biomarkers and biofeedback that your body's presenting to you every month in that phase of the cycle of the bleed. Each phase of your cycle has 4 healthy phases: follicular phase, where the eggs are developing on the ovary; ovulatory phase, where one of them reaches full maturity and travels down the fallopian tube; the luteal phase, where the body manufactures the endometrial lining and holds it in place; and then the bleeding phase, where the lining is released. Each of those phases has optimal hormonal ratios, and each of those phases, when those ratios are not optimal, have common symptom patterns. And at each of these weeks of your cycle, watching and monitoring what your symptom burden looks like and your symptom pattern is one of the best ways for you to biohack your health as a woman, to take this information in and not flush it down the toilet without looking. A couple of years ago, I made national and feminist history by being the first human to go on national television and use simulated menstrual blood to explain what a healthy cycle should look like during the bleeding phase and what it could mean hormonally when it's, the wrong color or the wrong texture. And I think it's just something that we should all know and keep in mind that in 2015, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists decreed that your period should be considered your 5th vital sign. And just so that we put that into context, your other 4 vital signs are the things they take when you go to the emergency room, right? Your blood pressure, your temperature, especially in our pandemic world. If you have a menstrual bleed color that is very, very dark and clotty, I would want you to react to that with as much action as you would if you had an elevated temperature. And so does the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists. And I'm assuming that has now become a more globally accepted understanding that our cycles as women are so germane to our health overall.
The bleeding itself, when it comes 2 weeks after ovulation, will be no longer than 7 days. It'll usually be between 2 to 7 days. And it should be no more than about 80 milliliters in total of menstrual fluid lost over all the days of the bleeding. And so that looks like about 4 or 5 tablespoons in total. The other thing that defines a healthy menstrual cycle is it should be essentially symptom-free. We have this narrative that periods should be difficult in some way, but that is just not the case. If everything is going well, then the menstrual cycle should just arrive with no significant premenstrual symptoms, not too heavy, and not painful. Period pain is common, but it's not normal, and debilitating period pain is never, ever normal.
We're going to look at period pain in episode 6 of The Shift, because as Dr. Lara Bryden has said here, period pain is not normal. PMS is not normal. Sore breasts are not normal. Acne is not normal. These things are all incredibly common, but that doesn't make them normal. When I'm working with patients at Shift, I'm using these symptoms to determine what is dysfunctional with this patient's hormones. It guides our naturopaths to make better decisions on what testing to order and which herbal medicines we might use. Your period is a barometer of your health, and the fact that the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists recognises this is a massive milestone for the treatment of women everywhere. Let's see how Nat Kringudis explains the menstrual cycle and flesh out what I told you earlier in the episode.
A regular menstrual cycle is from 26 to 34 days, and that can be a different day every month, meaning it could be 32 this month, 28 next month, 27 the one after. That's considered a regular menstrual cycle. And so with that in mind, typically you would see a period for anywhere between 3 to 5 days. Some women bleed a little bit longer. And from the period phase or the bleeding phase, we head into the window of pre-ovulation and then ovulation. Obviously, ovulation is when our body and certain hormones, our luteinizing hormone, sends that message to say to your ovaries, right, today's the day, it's time to ovulate. And so within that first phase, which is called the follicular phase, it's when the follicles on the ovaries are growing, and then you get that messenger for one of the most mature follicle to come off the ovary and be ready for fertilization. That's ovulation. And so that's the pattern of the follicular phase where estrogen is at its highest. Estrogen is also an excellent hormone. We all need a good balance of estrogen and progesterone, but estrogen is, the thing that also helps us grow a nice healthy lining and amongst many other things. So that's kind of the first phase of the cycle, and then we move into the luteal phase. And so that's that post-ovulation and premenstrual phase that we see. And we really should feel good at this time, and this is when progesterone is at its peak, and ovulation being in the middle of the cycle, hopefully, then allows you to say, okay, well, I'm halfway through my cycle, so there should be roughly another 2 weeks before I see a period again. And as we cycle through that luteal phase, we see progesterone rise. And if there's not enough progesterone, we can definitely see all sorts of symptoms. But in a normal menstrual cycle, you'll see that hopefully you kind of go through those 2 weeks, probably getting to, a day or two before we'd anticipate your period to be due, where you start to feel a little bit hormonal, I guess is the right word. And then that pattern repeats itself. That gives a woman so much information, because if she can pinpoint when she's ovulating, she can know when she's fertile, she can understand that her body has this rhythm and that there's certain phases that she'll feel a certain way. And then there's that other side of the cycle where our period is, and we should be able to recognize that we want to kind of be inward. We want to sit on the couch. We want to sleep a little bit more. Maybe we don't want to exercise. So that's a 101.
If you're curious about your hormonal health, take our quiz. You'll get a report with insights into some key areas you need to look at when it comes to getting your hormones in alignment, as well as some handy tips to get you started. Go to theshiftclinic.com/links. Now we begin to understand that we can tune into our cycles and understand that a particular symptom or feeling we have is associated with a particular phase. We can track these symptoms and find patterns which may allow us to understand where things might be out of balance. At Shift, the regular tracking of your monthly menstrual cycle is something that we do for every client. We always look at hormonal testing, but tracking your cycle symptoms is just as important. We also often track temperature, which can give you information about thyroid function if you're ovulating and whether you're making enough progesterone in the luteal phase. You can download our cycle tracking sheets and how-to guides for free at theshiftclinic.com/links. Now, where this gets a little tricky is in the instance where you might not ovulate. Since ovulation usually precedes a period, this can mean you have a condition called amenorrhea, or the absence of periods. Amenorrhea can be caused by a hormonal deficiency, issues like PCOS, thyroid dysfunction, or low body weight. But you can have a period without ovulating. While this is not as common, it certainly is not rare, and it's worth talking about. First of all, I asked Dr. Lara Bryden what the impacts were of not regularly ovulating.
The first thing to think about is that the hormone we make after ovulation, progesterone, is what we need to maintain a healthy uterine lining. So one of the problems with chronically not ovulating, if you're not on contraceptive drugs to deal with that situation, is that you can build up a thickened uterine lining. And so that's common with PCOS, for example. And that's one of the reasons why if women aren't ovulating regularly and having a regular menstrual cycle bleed, then they can tend to a thickened uterine lining. And that's one of the arguments for using contraceptive drugs. But you can get around the problem of a thickened uterine lining by ovulating and making progesterone. And that progesterone helps to promote the normal, healthy shedding of the uterine lining. In contrast, anovulatory cycles are really quite common. They're a key feature of PCOS, but they can happen in other situations as well, including perimenopause. And some of the downstream effects of an anovulatory cycle, or a cycle where ovulation did not happen, is there can be unusual bleeding. So bleeding that goes on too long, bleeding that is irregular, erratic. A lot of the time that gets referred to as a situation of estrogen dominance or hormone imbalance. But through my lens, I think it's important to use the term anovulatory cycle because that really is more precise in terms of what is the problem. The problem being ovulation did not occur. The problem being, in that case, you make estrogen but no progesterone to balance it.
I completely agree with Dr. Lara here. It is so common for me to see a patient with PCOS where that is their only diagnosis. They often haven't tracked their cycle or had the proper testing necessary to understand the why behind what is going on. So at Shift, we don't treat PCOS, we treat the patient and their causes of anovulation, as this is what is really important. Let's look at some of the reasons why you might lose your period altogether.
There are many ways to lose a period. The first step is the doctor, so they can rule out things like a problem with high prolactin, which is the hormone that we make during breastfeeding, but women can make it even in the non-breastfeeding situation, in which case high prolactin would be the explanation, be the thing that needs to be treated. Another example is a problem with the thyroid or thyroid disease, which can cause irregular cycles or no cycles as a symptom. So it's about being a detective and figuring out what is the reason that the menstrual cycle has disappeared. Our period is our monthly report card. So we get a regular ovulatory menstrual cycle if everything is going well. And by everything, that means healthy thyroid function, healthy insulin function, healthy gut function, not gluten sensitivity or celiac disease, for example, which can cause lack of periods. There's definitely been an uptick in women not eating enough to fuel their hormonal system. And it does affect all hormonal systems. It does affect ultimately thyroid health, but the menstrual cycle is the most sensitive of the hormonal systems, especially when it comes to undereating. So women can be active, they can exercise, but they just need to know they need to eat way more to keep up with that. And one of the things that happens with female athletes is that, unfortunately, our appetite doesn't always tell us how much food we need. I think, exercise itself can be a bit of an appetite suppressant. So for anyone who's exercising or, training strongly, regularly, you really need to get down and do some calculations or get a dietitian or nutritionist or a naturopath to help you do those calculations of how many calories you're going to need to keep up with that. And your period can be a handy gauge because ovulation will be the first thing to switch off with undereating. Losing your period to undereating is not a malfunction. It's the brain doing exactly what it's supposed to do, which is to not attempt to make a baby when there's not enough food to make a baby.
This is also something that we see at Shift frequently. Women have such different needs than men, but often our dietary and workout regimes don't take this into account, and sometimes we can harm our bodies by over-exercising or under-eating. We talk about this a lot in episode 11, where we cover weight loss, metabolic health, and intermittent fasting. Eating disorders such as anorexia, bulimia, and disordered eating can also impact menstruation. Listen to episode 13 of season 1 of The Shift for more information on this. We have many cycles in the body, the menstrual cycle being one of the most prominent. You would have heard of your circadian rhythm or your sleep-wake cycle, but have you heard of your infradian rhythm? Elusive is well known for her work on cycle syncing, or working with the power of our menstrual cycles so that we can get the most out of the hormonal fluctuations that occur.
We all know about the circadian rhythm, right? And we know how important it is. We know that if you don't take care of your circadian rhythm, you work the night shift for long periods of time, that it can have adverse effects on your health short term, your metabolism, your brain function, et cetera, right? And that long term, it can put you at greater risk for disease of inflammation. And there are two interesting things. We experience it in a 24-hour period of time, and that male hormonal patterns follow a circadian pattern, meaning they make all their testosterone while they're sleeping, and they have a daily 24-hour pattern of testosterone and cortisol peak levels and then low levels at night. And then they start over again, and they organize their fitness, their diet, and their work to take advantage of what's happening in their biology. Women at puberty have this second clock get activated, the infradian rhythm. And we experience that, yes, in our 28-day cycle. But like the circadian rhythm, which does not just govern your sleep-wake cycle, it governs so many more timings of different functions within the body. The infradian rhythm governs like your brain, your immune system, your stress response system, your metabolism, and your reproductive system. So what we're doing, however, is that we haven't been told about this rhythm, and we're applying the techniques that have been researched to optimize that 24-hour male hormonal pattern to our hormonal ecosystem. And it is causing us great disruption and exacerbating all of our health issues. So I think that it's a really exciting opportunity to have a fresh look at what is really going to move the needle for women to not just optimize their periods and their hormones, but, you know, I'm somebody who, like I said, used to be obese. This is also about optimizing your fitness and your productivity, because this is sort of at the deepest level how the timing of your optimal performance works, and aligning with that just opens up every door and every possibility for you.
So there are certain times in the menstrual cycle where we are stronger, where we have more gains within the gym, maybe weightlifting or in our performance. Turns out that being on your period doesn't make you weaker. It actually makes you stronger. Oh, whoa, that's so opposite of what I was taught growing up. So there are certain times within the cycle where you're going to see that you can have greater gains. There's other times in the cycle where you're going to maybe feel a little more fatigued. So like leading up to your period, you might fatigue a little bit easier. I mean, a lot of women feel tired. You're about to shed your endometrial lining. It's okay to pause and rest. So with that, it's really looking at, okay, when can we push and hit it hard to make the gains? When would be good recovery weeks? When are times that we should be focusing on flexibility? When are we more prone to injury? You know, what's really interesting as we talk about soccer is that there have been studies showing that if you sustain a head injury, which this is why I'm like, don't want my kid to play soccer. Sorry to the soccer people, but the ball is, you're using your head on the ball. Like that's like trauma. So with that though, they found that if these female soccer players sustained an injury and they were menstruating, they were more likely to recover a month later. But if they were within the 2 weeks of the luteal phase, they were more likely to have deficits later. And the hypothesis for this is how nourishing progesterone is for the brain and how it helps with brain inflammation. If you get a head injury, you roll into ovulation, now you've got progesterone flowing from the corpus luteum of your ovaries. That can be neuroprotective. That can actually help your brain heal. But if you are in that luteal phase window, you're about to experience a drop in these hormones. And we're now coming to understand that estrogen and progesterone, specifically, I mean, all hormones have effects on the brain, but these ones are super protective.
What this means is that if we're smart about it, we can work with our cycles to maximize our lives. Being in tune with our cycles has so many benefits. That was Dr. Jolene Brighton, naturopathic doctor and author of Beyond the Pill. I'm so glad that I got to connect with Dr. Jolene because we had some really interesting conversations, and you'll hear from her more as we move through the series. Balancing or normalising hormones is one of our main aims at Shift, and we've worked with thousands of women with irregular menstrual cycles. But there can be a lot more to it. Sometimes it isn't the hormone that's the issue, but the impact of that hormone on other body systems that sets you over the edge. Besides sorting out fertility, there are many immediate benefits to having hormones that aren't crazy, and Dr. Lara Bryden touches on some of that here.
Estrogen affects immune function, affects something called mast cells and histamine. So some women can get a histamine or an immune response from estrogen, which looks like headaches or irritability or even rashes sometimes, breast pain. Not all of that is a direct effect from estrogen. So rather than just focusing on ways to lower estrogen, another strategy is to look at ways to stabilize and normalize immune function so you don't get a mast cell or histamine response. Another example of a hormone getting a bad reputation it didn't deserve is progesterone and premenstrual mood. The conventional view is that progesterone is bad for mood, which is completely wrong. Progestins, contraceptive drugs, are generally bad for mood. That's true. Our own progesterone is generally quite good for mood because it interacts with GABA receptors. But what can happen is if there is an underlying inflammatory state or often sort of immune state, then there can be an abnormal response to progesterone. So some women can experience anxiety from progesterone, and that's really more to do with their response to the hormone itself. Likewise, many of us can experience mood symptoms as progesterone drops away at the end of the cycle. And that's not the fault of progesterone. Again, that's our response to it. The resilience of our nervous system and our hormone receptors to adapt to the natural decline of progesterone at the end of the menstrual cycle.
In the next episode of The Shift, we're going to take a deep dive into contraceptive drugs like the pill, the impacts that they have on our bodies, and what to look out for when you need to use these medications. I hope that by now you're beginning to grasp some important concepts around your hormones, cycles, and how they impact your health. If you're loving The Shift so far, please leave us a review. We love to get your feedback, and it does help us to reach so many more people.
Coming up on The Shift.
The pill is chemical castration.
We don't have to be afraid. We just need to be informed.
There is some evidence that going on the pill at a young age in adolescence is associated with depression and anxiety.
The majority of women struggle when they break up with birth control.
I didn't know what it was like to feel like me until I stopped taking the pill.
Upwards of 58% of women are using birth control primarily for symptom management.
This series is a production of The Shift Clinic. Hosted by Katherine Maslen. Music and sound design by Shade Furlong. Thank you to all of our experts. For more details on them, go to theshiftclinic.com.
We can be. We must be.
The first generation to end extreme poverty.
The generation most determined to fight injustice
and inequality.
The generation that saves the planet
from climate change.
And this is how we will get it done.
The global goals.
A 15-year plan for everyone, everywhere.
with no one left behind.
The global goals are a framework that collectively help us
support the health of our people
and the planet.
At Shift, we are ambassadors for the global goals.
This project supports global goal number 6.
Clean water and sanitation.
Every time you listen
to an episode of The Shift,
we provide a day's access to clean water
for a human in need
in Malawi, Africa.
Water is the foundation to health, and we believe
every human should have access
to clean, healthy water.
So please share this podcast wide
and keep tuning in
so we can impact those who need it the most.